This evening, the program will be as follows. I'll be introducing in just a moment Dr. Coulter, who will introduce our featured guest speaker formally. And then once our lecturer has finished, then we'll be taking questions. I'd like to make sure that it's in an organized, appropriate form. So we're going to make sure we have a microphone down here. So once the questions get started, we'll acknowledge who it is that's going to get up to ask their questions. Instead of a lineup that'll go back to the stairways, if I could ask, what we'll do is we'll acknowledge 2 people at a time. They can come up to the microphone, ask their questions, and then we'll acknowledge 2 more, and we'll just keep going until we're through the program. And then, of course, we'll thank our speaker at the end of the evening. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Rebecca Coulter, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Education, who will formally introduce, as I said earlier, our distinguished guest speaker this evening. Dr. Coulter's research interests are well known nationally, dealing with the history of Canadian education, gender equality, and the politics of education. She also has a special interest in high school activism, which is where I assume most of you people came from tonight. She has received numerous awards of merit in her chosen field, and I would ask her to come forward to formally introduce our featured guest lecturer. Rebecca?
Thank you, Faisal. Fellow citizens of the world, surely we are here tonight because, to use that old cliche, Robert Fisk is a man who needs no introduction. And even if he did, you can look him up on the web to discover the basic facts of his life. Although he's just told me that half the stuff on the web is a lie. He was born in 1946. He holds a BA in English and Classics from Lancaster University. He has a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, although some sources say it's in history, which is the one I'm going with, because as a historian I'd like to claim him for myself. Well, you see, the other sites say political science from Trinity College Dublin. Surely if anyone knows that politics can never be a science, it's the Irish. He was the Middle East correspondent for the Times from 1976 to 1988 and has been the correspondent for The Independent since then. He's the author of several books, one of which you must purchase this evening outside this room. He has spent more than 30 years in the Muslim world. He speaks Arabic. He holds many awards. You can look them up on the web. He's covered the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Iran-Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War, the Lebanese Civil War, conflicts in Kosovo and Algeria, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and of course the Iraq War. Now, I've just met Robert Fisk for the first time today, so I'm being rather presumptuous here. But let me say anyway, I think the details of his life are no measure of the man. A journalist and writer who brings honor to his profession. And it's a profession much in need of honorable men and women these days. Robert Fisk is a public intellectual for the world. Courageous, thoughtful, passionate, straightforward in speech and in script. He exposes hypocrisy and greed. He challenges authority and power. He speaks the truth about war, the maimed and mutilated children, the raped and tortured women, human bodies seared by phosphorus, rotting corpses, and the stench of death. In one review of his new book, The Great War for Civilization, Fisk was described as combining a novelist's talent for atmosphere with a scholar's grasp of historical sweep. Indeed. But Robert Fisk does more than that. He helps us understand the whys of war, imperialism, oppression. And if we understand, must we not also act? Please join me in welcoming to our midst one of the world's leading journalists, Robert Fisk.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad nobody told you to turn your mobile phones off, because a few months ago in Dublin in Ireland, I said that anyone whose mobile phone rang while I was lecturing would be sold into slavery. And immediately a mobile phone rang, and it was mine. So keep your mobile phones on, mine is. There's no problem. I should end this little preparatory moment by saying that the web is wrong because I don't use the internet and I don't use email and I don't write webs on it. So anything you read on the internet, not my fault. I'm not going to give you a hard sell on my book tonight. I'm going to try and tell you how it changed my views of the Middle East and my feelings about my life there while writing it, and especially when I came to the conclusion. It's also a book about my father. Bill Fisk was much older than my mother, and he was a soldier in the First World War. He was sent to the trenches of France in August of 1918. He even took a camera with him against all the rules. And I have a picture of him in the trenches in his uniform and in the French city of Arras. He looks a bit like Burt Lancaster. He's actually on the back of the book in a little snapshot taken by a friend of his during the First World War. And the reason my father is in this book, I think, is because it's an attempt by me to apologize to him. As he grew older, he became a very right-wing man. He loved the British Tory party. He supported magistrates, courts, capital punishment, policemen. He became quite racist in his attitudes towards the Irish and people of different origins from the British. When he was dying in a nursing home, I didn't go and see him. But during the First World War, he was ordered to command a firing party to execute an Australian soldier who had been convicted of killing a British military policeman in Paris. Gunner Frank Wills of the Royal Artillery was 19 years old, the same age as my father. I found at the National Archives his last appeal for clemency, in which he asked the court to take into account his age and promised to live a straightforward life if they would give him mercy. They did not do so. But my father refused to carry out the order. He refused to execute a fellow soldier. And he too was therefore court-martialed. By now the war had come to an end, and so his punishment, rather than being shot, was to help dig up the rotting corpses of the Western Front and bury them in the great war cemeteries that still lie across northern France to this day. I still look back now and think that that was the finest thing my father ever did. One of the things my book is trying to do, I think, in retrospect I realize, is to appeal to the people who read it to refuse to accept the narrative of history as it is laid down by our presidents and prime ministers and by our generals and by our journalists. And my father, in his way, also refused to accept the narrative of military history, obedience to orders, execute those who are convicted by a military court-martial, and he refused. Frank Wills was executed in May of 1919 at 4:14 in the morning at Le Havre. I did go because that dark owl of journalism which exists in all reporters forced me to, back to the National Archives to request the execution papers, which I was given. I feared that somewhere over the decades my father perhaps had covered up his own involvement in an execution, but he had told the truth. The officer commanding the execution party was in fact, he was British, but he was a different regiment, different name, different age, different rank. So Bill Fisk had told the truth. In 17 months following my father's First World War, the victors, the British and the French, drew the borders. In just 17 months, they drew the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I've spent my entire professional career as a journalist in Belfast, in Bosnia, in Belgrade, in Baghdad and Beirut, watching the people inside these borders burn. So for me, the First World War, my father's war, and his little tiny photographs of no man's land, of himself on a horse at Azebrook in Belgium, near Ypres on the Western Front, have a special meaning. From the age of 10, my father would take me around the battlefields of the First World War. The Somme, Ypres, Verdun, Vimy Ridge, the great Canadian sacrifice at Passchendaele. So that by the time I went to school, I knew all about the execution, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 and how the First World War started. I knew all the competing superpowers, the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, the British, the French, and later, of course, the Americans. And so, in a sense, I grew up with a father who talked constantly about the First World War, and a much younger mother who in 1940 joined the Royal Air Force, and during the Battle of Britain spent her time in southern England repairing radio sets on damaged Spitfires, which had been shot down by the Luftwaffe. So I grew up with the idea of war in my mind. When I was 12, I decided to become a journalist after watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie called Foreign Correspondent. Hands up who's seen it in this room. Actually, you're slightly better than UCLA, I think. Yeah, you are. About 5 there. For the majority who don't know this movie, it involves Joel McCrea, the actor, playing Huntley Haverstock, crime correspondent of the New York Daily Globe. It's a fictional movie, of course, whose editor says, what we need in Europe is a crime correspondent. So off he goes just before the outbreak of the Second World War. He chases Gestapo agents in Holland. He almost gets assassinated by the German intelligence service in London. He witnesses the assassination of a prominent Dutch politician. He's shot down by a German pocket battleship over the Atlantic. He's rescued by an American destroyer from which he files a scoop to his office in New York. And he wins the most gorgeous woman in the movie. And I thought, at the age of 12, this sounded like the life for me. In fact, I was basking on a beach in Porto Covo in Portugal, briefly covering the aftermath of the Portuguese Revolution in 1976, when I got a letter from Louis Heron, my then foreign editor of the Times. Louis had been a Middle East correspondent himself. He was actually covering the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948. And he wrote me a letter pointing out that our Beirut correspondent, Paul Martin, had just got married to a billionaire German princess. It's a bit like the movie, isn't it? And a very glamorous lady, but she didn't want to live the first years of her married life in a civil war in Lebanon. So he said, I'm offering you the Middle East, Robert. It will be a great adventure, and there will be lots of sunshine, he wrote. Like a sword, I later commented to him. I recall all this so easily now because in the writing of my book, which included the help of a researcher who went through 328,000 documents, files, old notebooks, newspaper clippings, propaganda leaflets dropped by aeroplanes, which I'd amassed like a squirrel in old laundry bags in my library. In the beginning, in the first 3 or 4 years, 1976, 77, 78, maybe the first 5 years, I think I felt it was a great adventure. I was 29 when I went to the Middle East, 30 years ago now. And I remember seeing the Soviet convoys coming into Afghanistan, the descendants of the heroes of Stalingrad trapped in the Hindu Kush, the Iranian Revolution, the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. Indeed, at the very beginning, I found myself on the Shaf al-Arab River between Iran and Iraq, where my colleague John Snow of Independent Television News, he's now a prominent anchorman on Channel 4 News in Britain, you may have seen him there, he and I found ourselves involved, for reasons too boring to explain now, in trying to rescue the crew of a British ship which had become trapped in the Shaf al-Arab River with missiles and rockets going across it and round it. We decided, and John is the hero in this story, not me, we decided that the best thing to do would be to try and get them off the ship at night and bring them across to the Iraqi shore. John managed to get an Iraqi army commando team to help him. In those days, the Iraqis were the good guys. They were elite forces. They were invading Iran, and we loved them for invading Iran. So in these days, it was very nice to work with the Iraqi army, and they were very happy to help us. And eventually we went across this sunken, half-flooded date palm plantation on an island with bullets zipping around at hip height because the dogs abandoned on the island kept going arr, 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 every time they saw Western reporters. Thank you very much, the dogs. And when we got to the seashore, John went out in his flippers and with the Iraqi commando team, managed to get a rubber boat over, got on board the ship, got all the crew onto the lifeboat, and I got the hawser on the island and pulled the lifeboat across the Shatt al-Arab to the island. Being, of course, a British crew, most of them were Sri Lankans and Indians on board. I think there were 3 British citizens who were on, including the captain and his new wife. Of course, most of the crew came with all their valuable duty-free goods which they'd bought in Dubai before they went to Iraq and got trapped. So the lifeboat was piled gill to gill with colour television sets and refrigerators. And it was my mournful task, having got each seaman off the boat, to take all his colour television sets and refrigerators and chuck them back into the Shatt al-Arab River, because we couldn't carry them over the island. Eventually, we got them all back to Basra. The Iraqi commando brought in a bottle of whiskey for us all to celebrate. I took John's film to Kuwait, where his office's private jet flew me off to Amman. In those days, we didn't have, satellite dishes on the scene. We had one satellite dish in Jordan, and you waited until a single satellite went overhead. We got his film out. I filed my story to the Times of London. And in the morning, I woke up after 12 hours of sleep in the Intercontinental Hotel in Amman to find a telegram pushed beneath the door from my foreign desk in London. Ex-foreign pro-Fisk, it began. Why you no swam shark-infested Shatt al-Arab River? I read this little part of this chapter at the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War to a very dear friend of mine and said, that's the last happy story in the book. And she said, that is the end of the sweet stories. And that's how I began the next paragraph. That is the end of the sweet stories. Because from there on, my book is a pageant, a litany of torture, pain, suffering, injustice, war, death, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. It's very easy, as a reporter, to go and cover, say, the Iran-Iraq War. It's not easy, but it's easier this way. You spend 3 weeks on the front line with the Iranians, you survive, you get back to Tehran, you fly to Beirut, there's a war going on there, but not as bad. You go home for Christmas, you go on holiday in Europe, and then you go back to the war, maybe on the Iraqi side. But when you chop out and cut out all the bits in between and push together the war itself, you realize the unutterable suffering that those people in the Iran-Iraq War went through. The tens of thousands of Iranians who were gassed. Long before we cared about gassing, Halabja was what we latched onto and what we're going to accuse Saddam of being a mass murderer over. I remember traveling in 1983 back to Tehran on a military troop train from Ahwaz. And as I went down the carriages, there were compartments, they were old German-style trains. Every compartment was filled with Iranian soldiers coughing phlegm and mucus and blood onto cloths while they read the Quran. And after a while in that train, I began to smell this kind of sick perfume. And I went around opening all the windows because I realized it was the gas coming up. I didn't want to breathe in that gas, thank you very much. And that was the day, it later transpired, when Donald Rumsfeld visited Baghdad to shake Saddam by the hand, and please, Mr. Saddam, will you let us reopen the American embassy? It's necessary again to recall this for myself as well, to get the narrative of history right, to remember what was actually happening at the time. Saddam was our friend. And it's not surprising that in the court in which Saddam is being tried, and indeed he should be tried, though this court I have my doubts about, all 5 judges have been appointed by the Americans, and it has been so constructed that Saddam is not allowed to talk about that long period of close and friendly relations with Washington. That's something the Americans have ensured we will not be going back over in the narrative of history in the coming months, always supposing this trial ever ends. I must admit, when I got to the end of my book, and this is not necessarily a popular thing to say, and I've been saying it in Washington and Los Angeles, where it's a good deal more difficult perhaps than here, I did come to the conclusion at the end, after writing about the suffering of Muslims, often at the hands of Muslims, but with that constant cloak of injustice and control that we have exercised over the Middle East, that I'm very surprised that the Muslim Arab Middle East has been so restrained. I'm surprised it has not shown more violence towards us in the West. I'm not advising you to read the book. In some ways, I'd say no. our job as journalists is becoming ever more questionable for various reasons that I'll mention later. But I used to think that our life as a journalist was basically this. As a foreign correspondent, our duty was to be the people who wrote the first pages of history. It was we who witnessed war as neutral observers for the first time. We wrote. We were there as the first historians. So no one could ever say, we didn't know, no one told us. But more than 2 years ago, I had a long conversation with Amira Hass, that very fine correspondent of the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, who generally writes from Ramallah and whose dispatches are more eloquent and braver than anything written by her Western colleagues from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And she disagreed with me. No, Robert, she said, you're wrong. Our job is to monitor the centers of power, to challenge authority, especially when they want to go to war, especially when they're going to kill people, especially when they're going to use lies to do it. That, I think, is the best definition of our job, or what our job should be, that I've ever heard. And I always copyright Amira when I tell it to my colleagues. That's what we should be doing. I'm not sure whether we do that, though. I'm not sure whether we put out the warnings as fast as we should, or in as convincing a way as we should. In 1992, I made a film series for Channel 4 in Britain and the Discovery Channel in the United States and Canada called Beirut to Bosnia, 2 hours, 50 minutes on real cinema film. We showed it in cinemas as well as television. And the title was Beirut to Bosnia, How Muslims Are Coming to Hate the West. We filmed in Egypt, West Bank, Gaza, Israel, southern Lebanon, Beirut, Croatia, Bosnia, Poland. And at one point in the movie, I walk into a burning mosque in Bosnia. I mean, it's a documentary, it's not a feature film. And a year before, it's in a village called Chela in Serb-occupied Bosnia, 1992. A year before, I'd actually seen the imam of this mosque in his home. He'd given me coffee. I'd gone and he'd taken me and shown me his lovely little mosque. Now it was on fire, and the imam had disappeared with his family, and his house was in ruins. And as I walk up the steps of the mosque, as it's on fire, I say on the soundtrack, when I see things like this, I remember the place where I work, the Middle East, where if they strike out at us, we call it mindless terrorism. But when I see things like this, I say on the soundtrack, I wonder what the Muslim world has in store for us. And then I add, maybe I should end each of my reports with the words, watch out. When my researcher went back to track through all the various shots in the film, we found that I'd entered that mosque on September the 11th, 1992, 9 years too early to get it right. What was interesting is that when the film was shown on Discovery, it was condemned largely in the American press for being sensationalist. Muslims were not coming to hate the West. They had no reason to, journalists in America, in the United States, said about this film series. So, you know, in a sense, maybe my book is meant to be a warning too. Maybe it's a warning to me. Because when I look back at September the 11th, 2001, I see so many ways in which we failed you. We journalists failed you. On September the 11th, I was crossing the Atlantic from Europe in a plane. Actually, before I got on the plane, I had a phone call on my mobile from my features editor who said that a big investigation by me on the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which effectively proved that 800 Palestinians who survived it were later handed by the Israelis back to the Lebanese Phalangist militia allies of theirs who already committed the original massacre, and subsequently over the next 2 weeks, those men were killed as well. But suddenly, this couldn't run. A light aircraft had flown into one of the World Trade Center towers. I thought, that'd be a light aircraft, and then of course it turned into an airliner. And then a second airliner, at which point my plane took off. And I thought to myself, where are we going? Are we going to get to America? I doubt it. At which point, I said, I better tell the crew at the front. We were now 36,000 feet over the Atlantic, west of Ireland. And I said, does the captain know that we're flying to America and it's obviously under attack? The pilot came back, said, what do you know? I called up the satellite phone from business class, called the office, and he said, third plane into the Pentagon. Hold on, fourth plane into Pennsylvania. So I went back to the crew. I said, you know, this is what's happening. 4 aircraft now. And the stewardess just didn't look at us, but just kept saying, a lot of people involved, a lot of people involved. They must have done dummy runs. Where did the planes come from? Now, at this stage, we didn't know they were domestic flights, that they came from Boston and Newark. They could have come from Africa, Europe, Latin America. At which point, the purser on the aircraft and I looked at each other, and we went round the aircraft together with pieces of paper, looking for passengers we didn't like. I found 13. 2 in business class, the rest in economy. He found 14, most of the seat numbers married up. Of course, they were Muslims, and had darker skin and brown eyes, and some of them were reading the Quran, and others had worry beads, and some of them looked at me with suspicion, because I was looking suspiciously at them. And I realized, when I got back to the front of the aircraft, that in just 2 minutes, Osama bin Laden, for I was sure it was he, had managed to turn nice, liberal Bob into a racist. I was going around my aircraft with no proof of anything at all, racially profiling the innocent passengers. And it was then, I think, it dawned on me, because we were beginning to get more messages from London, that September the 11th was not intended to divide Muslims from the West, though that may have been one of the reasons. It was intended to divide the innocent from the innocent, to make us hate ourselves and hate others. And it would definitely achieve that aim. If anyone was going to say afterwards that this international crime against humanity had changed the world forever. If anyone was to say that, and they did, as we all know, within hours, then bin Laden would have achieved his purpose of setting up the innocent against the innocent. When the plane came back to Europe, my phone began to ring like a budgergar. CBS, BBC World Service, Rome, TV, etc. On the plane, I had written an article saying that the one question we would not be allowed to ask in the coming weeks and months would be the why question. We would be allowed to know, or ask, who 19 Arabs who thought they were Muslims? How box cutters, tall buildings, aeroplanes? But the moment you ask the why question, I said in that article, which I wrote on the aircraft, dictating to a copy taker, a lady with a typewriter in Leeds with earphones on, the moment we ask that question, we will be accused of being anti-American, anti-Western, pro-terrorist. Because, as the late Edward Said said, the one taboo left in the United States is a discussion of the United States policies and relationship with the Middle East, both with the Arabs and with the Israelis. You can talk about blacks, you can talk about gays, you can talk about lesbians, but not that subject. That's verboten, except for the experts. Those on the frontier of criticism, like my good friend Tom Friedman, they're allowed to go a little bit close to the minefield, but otherwise no. On that plane too, I had also written an article about bin Laden himself. I said, you know, I hate the idea of finger pointing, the suspect game in journalism. But when you had international crimes against humanity on this scale, in New York, Washington, Pennsylvania, one was entitled to ask who had declared war on the United States, and bin Laden had. I've met him 3 times. I've got to know him quite well. And the last time I spoke to him on a mountain in Afghanistan, he had said to me, Mr. Robert, his exact words, from this mountain upon which you're sitting, there was a big camp there. Of course, it was originally built by the CIA, wasn't it? Because bin Laden was on our side. From this mountain upon which you are sitting, we defeated the Soviet army and helped to bring about the defeat of the Soviet Union. Exaggeration, but a certain amount of truth in that. Then he went on, and Mr. Robert, I pray to God that he permits us to turn America into a shadow of itself. And of course, when I got back to Europe and turned on the television and saw the Twin Towers coming down, this biblical horror with the fog of smoke and dust over Manhattan, I thought, well, New York is certainly a shadow of itself. I don't know the degree to which the Bush administration had advance warning that something was coming, but I was certain that bin Laden was involved, and indeed he was. So that evening on the radio and television stations was pretty tough work. Not only had I written an article in The Independent saying we wouldn't be allowed to ask why, and by the way, we should, but I actually had on Irish radio a frenzied, screaming man, a professor at Harvard who shall remain nameless. I'm talking about Alan Dershowitz, of course. Who said, Robert Fisk, merely to ask that question, you are a dangerous man, you are pro-terrorist, you are anti-American, and that is the same as being anti-Semitic. But I got the message. If we were going to ask the why question, we were Nazis. which I suppose is why, in the later weeks, I kept receiving postcards, almost all from America, claiming that my mum, who was in the RAF repairing radios on Spitfires, was Adolf Eichmann's daughter. Most of these things I stick on the bathroom wall. These went in the bin. But that is what the stage we'd reached within 24, 48 hours of 9/11. You know, the first thing the cops do when they come to the scene of a crime, not that there are any crimes in London, but the first thing they do when they come to the scene of a crime is look for the motive. But when we had an international crime against humanity in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, the one thing we were not allowed to do was look for a motive. Like, the men who did it were Arabs. That means they come from the Middle East. Is there a problem out there? Huh? And it was amazing how the mainstream American, of course they're mainstream, the American press simply would not confront this issue. There was an environment. No, the Israelis were not responsible for September 11th, and nor were individual Arab governments, so we could talk about the Saudis for a long time. But the fact of the matter is an environment existed in the Middle East which gave rise to this. An environment which the more, in my book, I wrote about and went back through the archives of, the more I realized the degree to which we Westerners had shaped this region and cloaked it in injustice and chosen their kings and dictators for them. Of course, there would be the most lunatic, grotesque aberrations coming from this environment. Was it not time to address this? But no. What we had to believe is that the world had been changed forever, that it was good versus evil. They hated us because of our freedom. Give me a break. I don't think that the men involved in, the murderers involved in September 11th would have known democracy and got into bed with them. I'm sorry, I don't believe that 19 Arab murderers should change our world. It's not going to change mine. And I'm not going to let George Bush change this world. That's my personal feeling about it. But one of the things which one did discover when you went back again and again into the archives, into the history books, was what it must be like to be an Arab, Muslim, or a Jew in the Middle East over the last 100 years. If we go back to the Balfour Declaration itself, remember, it gave Britain support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It didn't say only the left-hand side bit. Many Jews at that period were perfectly entitled to think the British were going to give them all of Palestine as a homeland. And of course it said that there mustn't be any encroachment on the rights of the Arabs who lived there. And of course we betrayed those Arabs. Promises are meant to be kept. But I go back in a more deeper way than this. We keep going to the Middle East and wanting to free the peoples there. You know, not only did Pope Urban want to look after the Christians of the Middle East in the 11th and 12th centuries, Napoleon approached the coast of Egypt and issued a proclamation to the people of Cairo in the French expedition of the 18th century and said he wanted to liberate the people of Cairo from the pashas who were hanging them for the exercise of free speech. General Angus Maude, British commander of the British Army of Mesopotamia in 1917, invaded all of Iraq and captured Baghdad in the autumn of 1917. Shortly thereafter, he died because he didn't boil his milk. He died of cholera. But before he died, he put up on the walls of Baghdad a proclamation printed in English and Arabic. It said, proclamation to the people of the governorate of Baghdad. We come here not as conquerors, but as liberators to free you from generations of tyranny. The signature at the end is Angus Maude, not George W. Bush, but you see the point. Actually, a young soldier, Private Charles Dickens of the Cheshire Regiment in 1917, peeled one of these posters back off the wall in Baghdad and thought it would be important one day, and folded it up and put it in his knapsack, where it remained stained with his perspiration through 2 Iraqi summers. And eventually, before he died, he gave it to his daughter, who sold it to me at auction just before the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 for $2,000. Very expensive proclamation, but I put it in a frame and it stood beside my desk as I wrote this book. Because if you follow through on the British occupation, you find, of course, as many of you will know, that an insurrection began against the British occupation force in 1920. It began with the execution or murder of a man called Colonel Leachman in a village called Handari near Abu Ghraib, our favorite prison. I know Handari very well because I went there in 2003 to cover the death of the first American soldier to be killed by a roadside bomb in Iraq. His blood was still on the road. And while I was in Handari, I met the grandson of the man who killed Leachman, who pointed out to me that Leachman was murdered 100 feet from the spot where the American soldier had just been blown up and killed. What happened in 1920 after the murder of Leachman? The British decided to take retaliation. So they used heavy artillery to bombard and partly destroy a city called Fallujah. The British then surrounded a city called Najaf and demanded the surrender of a Shiite cleric called Badr, not Sadr, Badr. Actually, they got him. The Americans haven't got Sadr, but we got Badr. In the same year, 1920, British military intelligence in Baghdad sent a telegram to the War Office in London, the War Office of the Ministry of Defence of today. I've got a copy of that telegram, and it says, terrorists are crossing the Iraqi border from, quite right, Syria. That's exactly what it said. Then, if you read the Times parliamentary reports of 1920, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, stood up in the House of Commons and said, at this time you have to remember the British public had turned against the war in Iraq, the soldiers wanted to come home, they'd been there a long time, they were still there from the First World War, they were fighting the First War, and it was costing a lot of money, and there were too many bodies. We were burying our bodies, of course, in Baghdad. There were no refrigeration services then. And David Lloyd George said, if British soldiers leave Iraq now, there will be civil war. That's right. You see, you know what he said before I say it, because it's exactly fingerprint the same story. Only, of course, we didn't read these books. We didn't, even the journalists didn't go back on this before we carried out our illegal invasion, we, British and Americans, of 2003. You know, in August, I was taking photographs in the British War Cemetery in Baghdad, the North Wall Cemetery, just next to the Turkish embassy, which was suicide bombed in 2004. And why? The young men, 18, 19, 20, 21, the same ages as the young Americans and British soldiers coming home in coffins now, even if we don't see much of the American coffins. And into the cemetery came a patrol of American soldiers looking through the long grass. Now one approaches American troops in Iraq very carefully these days. On their vehicles it says, keep within 50 meters, deadly force will be used. So my theory of approaching Americans on foot is to put my pipe in my mouth, because I don't think Al-Qaeda smoked pipes, and walk up and say in as English as accent as I can, good morning, gentlemen. It always works, believe me. It doesn't sound like an insurgent. So the sergeant said, good morning, sir. I said, yes, hi. What are you doing? I said. And he said, we're looking for weapons. I said, have you read the gravestones? Look, same age as you. This is the insurgency. And the sergeant was a bit nonplussed, but the other soldiers understood immediately. And they all started laughing. American soldiers, by the way, in Iraq are very bright. They grow up quickly, they learn quickly, and they know what's going on. They know it is a hell disaster, to use Winston Churchill's phrase about Palestine in 1947. And they understood very well, and they actually went round and started reading the graves and talking about the ages being the same as their own soldiers who were dying. There's history coming face to face with history. The possible dead looking at the dead. I think in this way, you know how important it is that journalists should not only go into wars with a notebook, but with that essential history book as well. How many of us would have written differently about that invasion had we been able to have a little sidebar with all the lists exactly the same which happened with the British occupation of Iraq? In fact, you can go further than this. The Ottoman troops who were defeated by the British in 1970 were largely Arab, mostly from Iraq. But of course it was Mesopotamia, then it was part of the Ottoman Empire. We sent them to prison camps in India where they were abused. British military intelligence in Basra, before we invaded, announced to the British commanders that we would be greeted with laughter and happiness by the citizens of Baghdad and other citizens up the Tigris and Euphrates. Absolutely the same. And always we go to the Arab world with our guns and our horses and our Abrams M1A1 tanks and our swords and our Apache helicopters and our Humvees and our Bradley armored fighting vehicles and our thousands and thousands of soldiers, and we claim, oh, we're going to liberate you. We're going to bring you democracy. I don't think we care about democracy in the Middle East. Most of the dictators and kings and emirs there have gone there and appeared in charge of their people because we supported them and put them there. Saddam was our man. When the Ba'ath Party took over, the CIA gave the Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein the names and addresses of all the communists in Baghdad so they could all be arrested, tortured, and liquidated, which they were. The British government liked Nasser after the overthrow of King Farouk, until of course he nationalized the Suez Canal and had to be bombed. The Americans liked Colonel Gaddafi after he got rid of King Idris in Libya, until he bombed an American bar in Berlin and had to be bombed. We loved Saddam when he invaded Iran. The Germans gave him the gas, the Americans gave him helicopters, massive billions of dollars of funding. The British, of course, supplied Bailey bridges, radios. The Americans even gave him the photo reconnaissance pictures of the Iranian front lines. I actually met the German arms dealer who flew from the Pentagon to Cologne, to Frankfurt, to Baghdad with the pictures. But then, of course, he invaded Kuwait, so we had to bomb him. But most of these men are our men, and we don't put them there because we want democracy. We put them there to make sure that our resources, their resources, are always there for us and that they control their people. You know, if you go back to the period after Oslo, when Yasser Arafat, who comes very badly out of my book, I'm sorry to say, Yasser Arafat, who'd just been a super terrorist, was suddenly transformed into a super statesman and shook hands with Rabin and Clinton. Clinton it was, who quoted from the Quran, not Arafat at the White House law, and if you go back and read about it. At this point, violence continued in the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, we all thought it was going to be peace. And do you remember what the question was? The Israelis asked this question, and then the Americans asked this question, and then we journalists asked this question, and then the National Post asked this question, and the Globe and Mail asked this question. Can Arafat control his own people? Now we ask it of Mahmoud Abbas. Can Abbas control his own people? They weren't elected to control their own people. They were elected to represent their own people. And I don't think we want them to do that. We want them to control those unnerving, uncontrollable, generically violent Arabs. Look at the way we report the West Bank and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, we reporters. Ever since Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, told US embassies in the Middle East to refer to the occupied territories as the disputed territories, most US newspapers have gone along with this. Disputed territories. The BBC World Service now sometimes uses disputed territories. In the same way, colonies have become settlements, and settlements are often now referred to, on Fox News among others, as Jewish neighborhoods. The wall, which is bigger, taller, longer than the Berlin Wall, is referred to as a fence. You see the problem. Why would anyone, even a kid, throw a stone because of a garden fence? A property that's disputed, something that could be sold over a cup of tea or a court case. Huh? You see the problem. A neighborhood, a nice neighborhood like south end of London. It means that anyone who objects to this is generically violent, and thus through our reporting, through our softening of the semantics, because we're frightened of calling a spade in case we get criticized or become controversial, our editors get worried. Not the case with The Independent, by the way, but certainly with many newspapers, unfortunately for my colleagues. We reduce the semantics so that the actual conflict, if you're living on this continent and don't take an interest in the Middle East or haven't been to the Middle East, that conflict is unintelligible, incomprehensible. Like Arafat's spokesman, his family members who he sends off to the United Nations as spokesman for the Palestinian Authority, whose English is so lamentable it's impossible to understand what he's talking about. No wonder the Israelis win that propaganda war. They put up smart guys who speak beautiful English with a Brooklyn accent. But this is what our reporting has come to, you see. This is what we're doing. This is how we diminish reporting. Let's take it at a different length towards the self-censorship of television. When I go to war, I see the most awful, obscene things, and I write about it. I write about it as if I'm writing a medical report. North of Kuwait, the Kuwaiti frontier, just south of Basra in 1991, a British television crew and I came across a terrible scene. At least 100 Iraqis, many of them soldiers, but also including women and children, and men in civilian clothes, refugees from Kuwait who are running back to Kuwait from Iraq, Iraqis trying to flee Kuwait. They'd all been bombed to bits, quite literally, in the desert. And out of the desert came hundreds of hungry desert dogs. It was lunchtime. And they ripped all these bodies to pieces in front of us and raced off across the desert with arms, legs, bits of people's stomachs to eat. It was lunchtime. And my friends in the television crew filmed this. And I said, what are you filming this for? You'll never get it on. He said, just for the archives, Bob. I reported everything I saw with clinical detail on the front page of The Independent, and we printed it all. But of course, I was right about the television. They could not show this film. None of the obscenities, the mind-wrenching, gut-filling obscenities that we see on battlefields will ever be seen by you on television. Because there are editors in Toronto, London, Paris, Washington, wherever, who will say, no, 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 it is pornographic to show these images. It is obscene to show these images. Viewers could never take this at breakfast time, or lunchtime, or tea time, or dinner time, or whatever. And so they don't show these pictures. And in this way, television becomes complicit with governments that go to war. Because if you saw, and I know to some extent I'm preaching to the converted, but if you saw what I saw on the battlefield, you would never, ever, ever support a war again. Because war, and my editor Simon Kellner always cringes when I say this because he's heard me say it many times, is primarily not, as in Hollywood, about victory and defeat. It is about death and the infliction of death, and it represents the total failure of the human spirit. But we don't show it on television. We keep it from you. We hide it from you. We exercise autocensure, self-censorship. And this way we are complicit with war. Ironically, you can see what it's like if you go to the cinema. Saving Private Ryan will show you the kind of gore I see every time there's a war. It's pretty realistic. Even Kingdom of Heaven, the new Crusader movie by Ridley Scott, which is pretty good, I thought, actually, if you consider what Ridley Scott's other movies have been like, especially. It shows you the kind of vileness that goes on in battles. But that is imaginative violence. You're permitted to see that. Real violence is cut off from you, unless, of course, an Iraqi soldier is obliging enough to have died in a romantic pose, preferably against the horizon with his body intact. In which case, of course, you know how the sound over goes. The price of war. An Iraqi soldier lies where he blah, 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 blah. That's how the system goes. That's how journalism has become compliant. You know, one of the problems, I'm afraid, is American journalism. We're all guilty of making mistakes, but American journalism, partly in Canada, but particularly in the United States, because there is an osmotic, parasitic relationship between journalists and power. Reporters like access. Just watch any presidential press conference in the White House. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President. Yes, John. Yes, Mike. That's the relationship that exists now. So that the Pentagon correspondent and the White House correspondent and the State Department correspondent has become an echo chamber for the spokesman. So many stories now in our press are locked on to the officials. I haven't mentioned Judith Miller once this evening, by the way. Though I did note, since I was in Washington at the time, that when Ahmed Shalabi, who duped Judith Miller, turned up in Washington, he was treated with considerable caution by the press, some respect. After all, he was meeting Condoleezza Rice, he was meeting Donald Rumsfeld, he was meeting Fife. Incredible, incredible. Here is a man upon whom an FBI investigation is being carried out as we speak into his alleged passing of American secrets to Iran, and he flies into America. Imagine if next time I wanted to go to the United States, actually I'm going to Chicago in 3 days' time, I put on the back of my little green visa form, FBI investigating me for selling American secrets to Iran. Do you think I'd get a visa? Do you think Homeland Security would let me in? But Ahmed Shalabi, convicted fraudster in absentia in Jordan, he gets to Washington. Isn't that amazing? The extraordinary seduction of power in Washington is one of the most unimaginable and, for me, incomprehensible phenomena in journalism. I'll give an example of what happens when this is a recent phenomenon, because I picked my Los Angeles Times when I read it actually in San Francisco on Wednesday. So it's November 16. This is to show how the system of power works. This is a story you may have seen in other, I'm sure it's been reprinted in Canada. In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind, this is Mr. Zarqawi, who may or may not be alive, stays a step ahead of the US. And the story basically is it's trying to explain why the American military haven't got Mr. Zarqawi, if indeed, as I say, he is alive. Let me give you the sourcing of this story by Josh Meyer and Mark Mazzetti, Dateline Washington. The sources: column 1, page 1, US authorities say, US officials say. Column 2, officials from several US agencies said, US authorities say, US officials said. Page 10, A10, column 1, several US officials familiar with the story said. Those officials said. The officials confirmed. American officials complained. Column 2, they said, US officials stressed. Column 3, US officials believe, said one senior US intelligence official. US officials said. Jordanian officials said. We vary our sources to make sure the story is correct, you see. Column 4, page 810, several US officials said. The US officials said. Column 5, American officials said. Column 6 gets better. Officials say US officials, the US officials said, one US counterterrorism official said. Sometimes I think the New York Times and the LA Times should be entitled American officials say. That's all you need. But what I'm trying to show you is what has happened to journalism. You see, in the American School of Journalism, believe me, it also to some extent is there in Britain too. And let me just interrupt by saying the most extraordinary thing in lecturing in the United States, which I do very regularly, is that most Americans know and understand this rubbish is rubbish. Only the journalists think it's not. The most amazing thing, 2 days ago, Ethan Bonner reviewed my own book. I'm pleased to say very critically. I wouldn't want to say anything very nice coming from him. But in the middle of it, he quoted me as saying that I attack American journalists for saying that occupied territories are called disputed and that neighborhoods, that settlements are called neighborhoods. Completely unaware of the degree to which the number of readers would agree with me. He thought that it was outrageous that I should suggest this. That is the distance between the reader and the journalist. It is quite remarkable what happens when you see this distance opening up. The amazing thing, you know, in the Middle East, I can very often and do have lunch or dinner with my American colleagues. And they're very interesting to chat to. They know a lot. They do their homework. If you forget the fact they all go off to the US Embassy and get briefings from the ambassador and the CIA spooks. But what they've got is right. But when you open the paper next morning, their reports are unmitigatedly boring because they have none of their own intelligence and knowledge in the story. When they want to have an opinion, they sit in Cairo or Baghdad and call up some idiot in the Brookings Institution, far away in Washington, to give an opinion. And that is informed reporting. You know, we are the nerve endings of a newspaper. My editor, Simon Kellner, now says that we are a views paper rather than a newspaper. He wants the journalist to tell us what the hell is going on. He doesn't want the agency frightened reporting. This idea that you have to give 50% of your story to each side in a dispute is ridiculous. If we were covering the slave trade in the 18th century, would we give half our story over to the slave ship captain's remarks? No, we give it to the slaves, to the victims. If we're present at the liberation of an extermination camp in Nazi Germany, are we supposed to give half our story over to the SS spokesman? When I covered the Palestinian suicide bombing of the Sbarro pizzeria in Israeli West Jerusalem in August of 2001, I was just down the road. I found an Israeli woman with a table leg sticking out of her, a kid with his eyes blown out of his head. More than half the 22 dead were Israeli children. Was I supposed to give half my story to the Hamas spokesman? No, I didn't. When I was in the Sabra and Shatila camp in September 18th, 1982, clambering over corpses when the Phalange militia was still inside, I wrote a very brutal piece about the victims and the murderers. And I said the Israelis were watching, which they were, and the Khan Commission confirmed it in '83, from the rooftops and did nothing. Was I supposed to give half my story over to the IDF spokesman? Absolutely not. I think, you see, that we journalists should be like you. We see an atrocity like you might see, and if you see something terrible on the streets of London, you feel anger, passion, compassion with the victims. We have feelings too, and we should be writing about it, and you should be able to read it in the newspaper. You know, I think that, in a sense, what we have to do as journalists, not to write pontificating articles for the benefit of diplomats. What I try to do is to write a letter to a friend. That's what my reports are. Hey, would you guess what I saw today? And do you know who did this? And that is what someone wants to know. But still, we can't go in and grasp the way this might be done. In Iraq now, we have major problems with our journalism. It's not caused just by journalists. The nature of the insurgency, as we saw again 3 days ago, when 2 suicide bombers tried to destroy the Hamra Hotel, where many of the Western journalists live and hide, shows what they think of reporters. There is no protection for Western correspondents, or indeed Arab correspondents in Iraq, or indeed Japanese correspondents, as we know. Western reporters have been assassinated, they've been shot dead by the Americans, they've been murdered by insurgents in front of video cameras. All of us who still go to Baghdad live in fear of the gunman in the car, knowing that 1 hour later, a videotape will pop up. Mr. Bob, like this. Please, Mr. Blair, will you withdraw all British troops by Friday? You can imagine what Mr. Blair would say, can't you? Poor old Bob. I bet he would. So we live in fear there, but there is a problem. There has now started, indeed, the events of 3 days ago suggest not with much good reason, what I call hotel journalism. Reporters who go to Baghdad, get a helicopter from the airport to the green zone, get an armed group to take them to their hotel, and they stay in their hotel room for 3 weeks, use the mobile phone to call the American authorities, the British authorities, the Iraqi government, and send out their stories each day. But, okay, fine, they have security people making sure that they can't leave. They have their own security advisors saying it's too dangerous to go on the streets. I understand this. But what they don't do is tell the viewers and the listeners and the readers that they don't leave the hotel room, thus giving the impression that they can make a tour d'horizon of Baghdad, that they can go and check it out when the Americans say they've killed 142 terrorists in Tal Afar, and that reporting it means they've been on the streets, they can confirm it, when in fact they can't go at all. This, for me, is a very serious problem. NBC television is now caged on the 7th floor of a hotel, permitted by its security advisors to go to the restaurant downstairs, but not to the swimming pool, which is overlooked by a building in which Iraqis live. The Associated Press lives behind 2 steel walls in the Palestine hotel. It takes me 10 minutes to negotiate my way through the security. The New York Times has a concrete and steel stockade on the Tigris River with 4 watchtowers and a small militia of Iraqis armed with Kalashnikov rifles wearing T-shirts saying New York Times. I kid thee not, as Captain Krieg said in the Mutiny on the Bounty. This is journalism Iraq style, and it's awful. Some of us, Patrick Coben of The Independent, the Financial Times, The Guardian, until they got kidnapped 2.5 weeks ago, mostly only briefly. 5 days ago, The Guardian said it would no longer send reporters to Baghdad. And me, when I'm there, I'm going back in December or January, we still go out on the streets of Baghdad. I travel with 2 Iraqi friends in a battered old black car, or a white car, or a red car. We change them around. That, it seems to me, is the only way to move if you have a chance of surviving. Go around with an SUV full of armed men. Ajnabi, foreigners, get them, you see. So I'm much happier in my little black car, or my little red car, my little white car. But look how difficult it is. The Nafta bus station in August, 2 suicide bombers. Bob jumps in his car with his 2 Iraqi mates, and off we go. And we arrive at the bus station. There are body parts of the suicide bombers. I jump out of the car, a burning baby next to a bus. 20 seconds interviewing an eyewitness until 40 or 50 Iraqis are hammering on the roof of the car in fury. So we have to drive away quickly. Mouse journalism. You see? I can write 600 words, 700 words, but is it worth it? Is the risk any longer worth the story, or is the story any longer worth the risk? Sometimes. Little anecdotal thing here to show you what it's like if you can go out. I still go out to lunch in Baghdad because I'm sort of evil and want to do it. Last time I decided I'd go to the Ramaya restaurant, one of my favorites, near the river. Big red neon sign, Ramaya. Fine Lebanese red wine, international menu. Only it had changed. It had transmogrified into a different kind of restaurant. Because when I went up to see it in August, it was called the Zamoun al-Khair. It was a green neon sign, a big Quranic restaurant. And when I went inside, there was no more international menu. It was all in Arabic only. And there was certainly no more Lebanese red wine. And I talked to the waiters, I talked to some of the Iraqis coming in for lunch. You need to see this to see how life is changing in Baghdad. There's a Shiite government now. Things are altering in Baghdad. Okay, that made 700 words. That was foolhardy and ridiculous, but it was a little tiny fragment of Iraqi life that you could still just write. Sometimes you can do more important things. It needs about 20 minutes to do an interview maximum in Iraq, after which you've got to leave. Because 20 minutes is the time we reckon, maximum time, it takes a man with a mobile phone to say, grey-haired English reporter just gone into this building, get here quick, and 20 minutes before the first gunmen arrive in the car. So when I go to the mortuaries to try and count the dead, I spend 20 minutes maximum each trip, and I don't tell them I'm coming, of course, in case one of those nice morticians also has a mobile phone. Ajnabi on his way, Ajnabi on his way. So one Monday in August, I went to the central mortuary, the city morgue in Baghdad. At 9 o'clock, there were 9 corpses there. At 12 o'clock, there were 26. One, a young woman with her hands bound behind her back, shot 3 times in the brain. Another, a baby, shot in the face. There are death squads working for everyone in Baghdad, as well as mafia and criminals, kidnapping for money. A colleague of mine in the Irish Times went to the referendum voting booth on the referendum on the Constitution and found a young Shiite couple who had just voted. And she said, oh, yeah, and do you have any children? And the young woman started to cry, and the husband said, we had a son, he was kidnapped last year, and we have never seen him since. This is the life of Iraqis. Back to the mortuary. The third visit, and I know all the mortuary attendants in all the hospitals because I've got to know them. They know I come and take details. I want to know how many Iraqis are dying. On this occasion, in August, they switched on the computer and pulled up the official Ministry of Health details from each mortuary of how many Iraqis had died by violence in just Baghdad in just July alone. And the figure was 1,100. More than half the total American dead since the Anglo-American invasion of March, April 2003. More than half the total American and British dead in 1 month. And they were Iraqis. But of course we don't care about Iraqis. So we hadn't reported it. We hadn't counted those corpses in the mortuary. It's a pretty horrible thing to do, by the way. There's not a lot of electricity, not a lot of air conditioning. There's flies everywhere. You know the smell. I hope you don't, actually. But at least we could get this piece of information. I should add that American and British diplomatic advisors to the Ministry of Health have specifically told the ministry they must not give these figures to journalists. Not only do we not care about the Iraqis, look how we give individual names and dates and pictures to our honored dead, American and British primarily. But we don't care about them. Not only do we not care about them, we prevent our people finding out about them. This is the situation in Iraq now. Let me just tell you, by the way, from Mosul and Kirkuk to the north, right down to Basra, is totally outside central government control. It is an insurgency, tribal gunmen on the streets, mafia, bandits on the roads. It takes me 2 weeks to plan a trip 80 miles south of Baghdad to Najaf. 2 weeks to arrange it. And even then it's unsafe. The last time I took that road, Highway 8, the lovely throat-cutting road, it was littered with burned-out American trucks, smashed police cars, abandoned checkpoints, and armed insurgents. Mahmoudiya, Iskandariya, all the way down to the edge of Najaf. This is the Iraq you're not supposed to see or to read about. And when we try to do it, I don't know if it's worth our lives anymore to do this. I suppose it is maybe to some of you. I don't know if it is to me. For the first time in my life as a journalist, I am asking myself whether an assignment can be continued in the Middle East. Algeria was pretty bad. Throat-cutting, Western journalists targeted and killed, but not as bad as this. Why did we go to Iraq? Was it for oil? Of course it was. If the major export of Iraq was asparagus, or carrots, or cauliflower, or apples, tofah, I don't believe the 82nd Airborne would be in Mosul, and I don't believe the 3rd Infantry Division would be in Baghdad, and nor do you. But there's another reason why. At a different time, I was on the same Highway 8, investigating the death of a poor Red Cross driver who'd been murdered in his car, driving back to Baghdad. And I found a family, Iraqi family, whom I think had seen the gunman who murdered the guy. But as we were talking, the ground began to tremble like an earthquake. And powering up the highway was the biggest military convoy I've ever seen in my life. It took 4.25 hours to pass me. A1, M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvee after Humvee, thousands and thousands and thousands of line troops in hundreds of trucks, 155mm artillery, lorries full of pre-concretized bases. I actually had houses for American military bases that were being enlarged on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. All these soldiers with their rifles pointing out the side, thousands of rifles pointing out the side of the trucks like porcupine quills, and Apache helicopters like big rodents over the palm trees. And it occurred to me, sitting in the muck on the side of the road with the Iraqi family, that 2,000 years ago, a little bit more to the west, Syria, Lebanon, we would have been sitting there as the tramp of the Roman legions went past us. You know, superpowers who make very bad peacekeepers have an almost visceral need to project military strength. We can go to Baghdad, so we will go to Baghdad and throw over Saddam Hussein. We will send our armies across the lands of Samaria and the caliphates and all the lands where civilization began. Empires don't like to sit behind frontiers. It makes them look neutered, impotent. They must stretch. Look at the Romans. They were out into the Syrian desert, almost as far as what is now the Iraqi border, when Crassus's legions were surrounded by Parthians, the Syrians of the time, on cavalry, on horses, and wiped out. And when Crassus was taken to the tent of the Parthians to negotiate a formal surrender, they chopped off his head and filled it with gold, because he was a Roman billionaire, and sent the head back to Rome. Not totally unlike the things that happen in Iraq today. The Antony of Cleopatra to go and get the standards back in the desert later on. So you see, you have this extraordinary situation of this need constantly to push power further and further, whatever the folly involved, whatever the ideology behind the war. I think we journalists constantly miss this point. Iraqis don't. An Iraqi said to me in August, Mr. Robert, can you explain something to me? The Americans, he meant special forces or air force or infantry or some form of military bases. The Americans are in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Algeria. Special forces have a big fortress near Tamanrasset in the southern Algerian Sahara Desert. In Qatar, in Bahrain, in Oman, in Yemen, in Kuwait, still in part of Saudi Arabia. Why are they there, Mr. Robert? I'm not sure I know. But you can take it further. You can go right up to the north. Greenland, Iceland, Britain, Germany, Italy, Bosnia now, Yugoslavia, Greece, joining up with Turkey. There is now an American iron curtain stretching from the Arctic to the borders of Somalia. Why? We don't ask this question. And because we don't ask it, we don't encourage you to ask it, which we should. Why is that iron curtain there? What lies beyond? It's in Pakistan, by the way, also, of course. What lies beyond? India, China, Russia. What is happening in the next few years? What is being planned for these next years? What is going on in Washington is what I ask. And I don't know, but I'd like to know. So I think should you. And here you see we have a new iron curtain, a whole new political, but forget about the whole issue of whether we're in Saudi Arabia or not, or why we went to Iraq or not. The geopolitical structures of the Middle East are quite extraordinary, and they pay no attention to any local feeling at all. I mean, forget the Egyptians or the Saudis. With this kind of geopolitical line, the individuals don't matter anymore, nor do the kings or the emirs, who will anyway not complain. One of the reasons why bin Laden is so popular, and he is popular in the Arab Middle East, is not because he flies planes into buildings. Most Arabs and Muslims would find that obnoxious and disgusting, obscene and reprehensible and evil. No, it's because he articulates the feelings of submission of Arabs to this huge Western control, this blanket of injustice across the region, in a way that their own leaders will not do. Even more humiliating, he says it from a cave. You know? And in this way, we are surprised that bin Laden is listened to in the Middle East. It's a pity we don't listen to him. You know, because this was an ideological war, in fact, because of the whole of our presence in the Middle East is ideological, we don't pay attention to intelligence information which might help us. Because we only pick those bits of information from the mainframe computers and the billions of dollars of CIA information and the humans and so on. We only pick that information which fits our preconceived ideas for our projects. Democracy, freedom in the Middle East, etc. Hence, for example, and you can find the full text of this in my book, because we found it, I got printed up everything bin Laden had said from 9/11 to now. Don't waste your time reading. Very boring. But 5 weeks before the Anglo-American invasion, in an audio tape, he said, during the Crusades, he meant the real Crusades, we're talking about 11th, 12th centuries, he said the followers of the Prophet made an alliance with the Persians, who of course were not Muslims then, they were Zoroastrians. And it did them no harm in this alliance against the Crusaders. Now, he said, I call upon Muslims in Iraq, he meant people who would favor his own Salafist view of the world, to be prepared to make an alliance with the socialists. He meant the Ba'ath Party, the army who fought in the Iran-Iraq war. Because although the socialists, he said, remain infidels, it is in our interest to have an alliance with them. Now, see leadership, the real insurgency, which is Iraqi, and which will eventually have to deal with Al-Qaeda because we can't do it. The Iraqi insurgency leadership is composed of the officers who fought in that war. The colonels are now generals. And I can tell you how I know this, because less than a year ago, I met 3 of the insurgency leaders in a neighboring country. Not Syria, Jordan, actually. And one man walked in, he was a general. He said, Mr. Robert, we meet again. I said, I've never seen you before in my life. He said, yes, you have. He said, in 1980, in September, you were under fire on the Iraqi front line, outside Basra. And I took the first tanks, Iraqi tanks, across the Karen River. And you climbed on my tank and you interviewed me. And since I don't use the internet, back in Beirut, I went through all my archives. And there he was. I did interview him on his tank. The Iraqi insurgent leadership on the Iraqi side, the ones who are actually attacking the Americans, not trying to start a civil war by blowing up Shiite mosques and Shiite marketplaces, are the officers, the leaders of the officers in that Iran-Iraq war. men who fought suicidally for 8 years, in many cases were taken prisoner and held for 10 years by the Iranians, twice as long as any World War II POW, and then returned home to find their families torn apart by UN sanctions, by us. And we expected them to greet us with roses and rice and rose water. In any event, let me just come to a conclusion by using an old equation which I've written many times in the paper and still write. The Americans must leave Iraq, the Americans will leave Iraq, and the Americans can't leave Iraq. And that is the equation which turns sand into blood. They will have to negotiate with the insurgency. I'm sure they will, with these men I met. They speak quite good English. Some of them were trained in America and Britain. They'll have to talk to the Association of Ulamas, which brings Sunni and Shiite clerics together. They'll have to talk to the Iranian element of the present government, the Dawa party, which the Americans and British diplomats keep saying, oh, they're wonderful democratic people, you know, we talk to them every day. The Dawa party were responsible for most of the kidnaps of Westerners in Beirut in the 1980s. They were responsible for blowing up the American embassy in Kuwait and blowing up the French embassy in Kuwait and trying to kill the emir of Kuwait in the car bomb. These are the people who understand full well what the Americans are trying to do in the region. We keep saying, oh, you know, journalists say, because politicians say, are the Iranians trying to interfere in Iraq? They're there in the government. The Skiri and the Dawa party were nurtured in Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. And we, the West, will need Syria and Iran to help us get out. But get out we must if there is to be an end to the appalling savagery being visited upon the Iraqi people. You know, I used to think that covering the Middle East was a privilege, watching history happen. And I think I'll go on trying to cover it because it's like some enormous epic book. You know, you're sitting in bed at night reading a novel or a history book that's so gripping and you can't put it down. You say, well, I just read one more chapter before midnight. And then you turn to a new chapter and it's already 1 o'clock in the morning. And before you know it, you see dawn through the crack in the curtains. You've been reading all night. Just one more chapter. And that, I think, is the way I feel about my job now. What's going to happen tomorrow? Even though tomorrow I wake up in my bed in Beirut, hear the palm fronds rustling outside the window and the Mediterranean on the sea just outside my balcony and think, where will the explosion come today? I don't necessarily mean literally. You know, after that 1992 film I told you about, where I went in the mosque on September 11, I actually found other interviews I'd done with Canadian television, for example, in which I said, there's an explosion coming. I didn't know why I said it, but living in the Middle East, you felt it. All people in the Middle East felt it. Something was coming. We didn't know about 9/11, but something was coming. As I said before and hinted to you at the beginning, writing this book was a very depressing experience. I had to finish writing every day at 3 p.m. It was too much. I actually became a very distressed person writing this book. It's a very unhappy book, and I will never write another book like it again in my life. But I suppose, in a way, I fear now that the last 30 years I've spent in wars, while most of the rest of the people I know have had families and lived in comparative safety and happiness in Canada or America or Britain, that maybe the last 30 years was a curse. Certainly was a curse for the people who live in the region. We cannot. We, the West, we can switch off history when we want. We can say, okay, end of World War II, new start for the world. Death of Hitler, death of Mussolini, destruction of Japan. The beginnings of the United Nations. The beginnings of what was to become the European Union. The end of the Cold War. I don't know if 9/11 will feature in this. But in the Middle East, they can't switch history off as we want them to. They can't switch it off. Mohammed Abu Radina, a friend of mine in the Sabra and Shatila camp, he's still living in dirt and filth and getting up in dirt and filth every morning because of the Balfour Declaration, because we didn't honor our promise to protect the Arabs of Palestine. For him, Balfour happened yesterday. This morning, an hour ago. This is where we cannot teach the Arabs to turn off history. Oh, we've got another new agreement, Oslo, the roadmap, democracy. I think the Arabs would like some of our democracy. I think the Muslim world would like a couple of packages of human rights off our Western supermarket shelves. But I think they want another kind of freedom. Freedom from us. I don't think you can found democracy in sand. You have to found it on justice, and we are not helping justice in the Middle East by sending our guns and our rifles and our Apache helicopters there. And it's the job of journalists to say this frankly, to you, and to write it frankly, and to say it on television if necessary. I think in the end, the book I've written, and I'm not telling you to buy it, it's up to you. I think it's the story of my curse. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
At this point, there's a few comments that I have to make before we start into our formal portion of the program with respect to questions and answers. First of all, Bob, on a personal note, it's hard to move a trial lawyer of some 20 years, and I pictured you the entire time as a trial lawyer trying to make your case to the jury, and I think the verdict is pretty well unanimous. Having said that, somebody asked me this evening, why do they always have you as a moderator for these controversial topics? And I said, well, number one, I don't think it's controversial, but I'd like to think it's because I'm a fair moderator, but I'm afraid that it's because I'm over 6 foot and over 250 pounds. So I say that because when we go through this, I want us to all be respectful and polite, which I know Londoners all are. Secondly, I ask, look, no matter what side of the issue you're on, you feel free to ask the hard questions, but none of us came here for political speeches from members of the audience. When you write your 20 books, we'll be happy to come and listen to you. So ask concise questions, because there's a lot of people here, there's a lot of people that have questions, and we want to be fair to everybody. And finally, I want you to remember the sage advice of my father, who's in his mid-70s now, who always told me before I speak, and I'm telling you before you speak, Faisal, it is always better to be silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. So with that introduction, I will ask our lecturer to acknowledge the people. I want you to come down here 2 at a time, so we don't have people blocking. You will sit down. We want you to be acknowledged. To come up, we'll ask our speaker to acknowledge you. Come up 2 or 3 at a time, and then when the last person is up, we'll acknowledge 2 or 3 other people, so we can do it in an orderly fashion. And I thank you all. You've been a great audience thus far, and I'm sure we'll make London proud.
Okay, hands up. Right, this lady here, and you, if you'd like to go to this mic over here, and this gentleman here, if you'd like to go to there's a mic over here, is there?
No, just one.
Oh, okay. Well, then 3 people. If you'd like to come over to this mic, the lady first. I'll come back to you in a minute. Sure.
Well, thank you for letting me go first. I'm Marina Zona, PhD business student at Ivy School. I'm originally from Russia, and I've seen Russian soldiers coming from Afghanistan. And in a way, they were very purified. They were not afraid. At the time when they were coming, we had a lot of mafia, like a lot of corruption, a lot of crime inside, and we still have, inside the country. And the people who went to Afghanistan, somehow, somewhere, they acquired these values of stand against the evil and do the right thing. And actually, even mafia was afraid of them. So do you think that similar tendency might happen with American soldiers when they come back? Can they be the seeds of the new truth, or?
I understand exactly. You understood the question basically is how the Afghan war transformed the Soviet army into a very brutal force, and is the same thing happening to the American army now? That's basically what you're asking, isn't it? Well, oddly enough, I was actually in Moscow talking to Soviet veterans of the Afghan war some months ago, and they said that they believed that was what was happening to the Americans because they were watching the television news in Moscow. And certainly, many of the former Soviet soldiers I talked to brothers and fathers who had terrible drug problems because of Afghanistan, and the way in which they now were brutalizing their families because they'd learned that the only way to actually impose yourself in the case of violence was to be violent yourself. So it did have an immediate effect, and it's having an effect even now on Russian families across the former Soviet Union, including, of course, the countries which are no longer Russian, like Ukraine. That's absolutely true. And I've seen the change in American behavior in Iraq. I've watched it with my own eyes. I've seen the way in which patrols that would once have gone around and happily handed out toffees to children now go around pointing rifles. Get back, get back, get back! I watched in Fallujah, even before the first siege of Fallujah, a Marine soldier getting up and saying to an old man in an armchair, if you stand up, I'll break your fucking neck. Right? I mean, I've watched this all the time. The fact that so many civilians are shot at checkpoints because there's too quick firing, that's the same phenomenon that came over Russian soldiers. And then, of course, it got worse and worse, and you ended up, your soldiers abused people in prison, and now our soldiers abuse people in prison. I mean, one of the things this is my last comment to you on this point. One of the things about Abu Ghraib is that we were very shocked to see these pictures. They're more coming soon, by the way. We were very shocked to see these pictures. You know, the man in the hood with the electrical wires, the dogs, the biting, the sexual abuse. The Iraqis weren't at all surprised. We keep saying, oh, if we show more of these pictures, the Iraqis will hate us even more. Iraqis knew all about what was going on in Abu Ghraib because they talked to their brothers and their cousins who had suffered there. Anyway, they thought that's how we behaved. And of course, it was how we behaved. That's the problem. And the moment we were going to say, and the Russians did this in a vice versa way in Afghanistan, the moment we were going to say, we're not as bad as Saddam, it meant that we could go up to, but not as far as Saddam, in our abuse and torture. You see, when you make Abu Ghraib the symbol of Saddam's shame, you're going to make it the symbol of your own shame too. It's like, you remember that wonderful line from Animal Farm, you don't want Mr. Smith back, do you? No, right? You don't want Saddam back, so don't blame us. And so the moment you make Saddam your moral compass, like the moment the Soviets made Babrak Karmal or Taraki the moral compass in Afghanistan, they could do what they wanted. And so do we. Yes, sir. And while you're there, anybody else wants a question, stand at the back of the queue. This is lovely. Oh, no. There's a lady there. Yes, please, with the veil on. Back here. After this gentleman here. Yes, please.
You talked about how the reason for the war was oil. But I'd like you to sort of explore the neocon connection, the Project for New American Century. Like Warmer talked about invading Syria, Rumsfeld, Cheney. They've been planning an invasion and attack on Iraq since 1996. There's that whole connection, and of course any ties to the Israeli, the Netanyahu document that was prepared.
I mean, what is Ed, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. What Ed is saying is basically correct. I mean, I can't go into everything because some of you would want to go home, rightly so. Of course, the Iraqi project fits perfectly into the neoconservative or conservative, we like to call them, the group of people like Fisk and Pearl and Rumsfeld, who projected this plan for Netanyahu when he wanted to become the Likud prime minister again in Israel. This is long back in the Clinton period, to invade Iraq, destroy Saddam, start a series of democracies, change the map of the Middle East. And in this sense, Iraq has both gone well for Israel and very badly for Israel, because it didn't expect, any more than the Americans did, that there would be this chaos and anarchy that followed the American invasion. But certainly Iraq, the most powerful country in the Arab world, perhaps it wasn't after Kuwait, but certainly symbolically was, the only country in the Arab world that has both water and oil. Most Arab countries have either water and no oil, or oil but no water. Iraq has them both. That is why it is so symbolically golden in the eyes of so many Arab Muslims. It has been broken. But you see, you can add on to this other issues. Many Lebanese who were delighted that UN Security Council Resolution 1559, following the murder of ex-Prime Minister Rafik Hariri on the 14th of February this year, had got the Syrians out and actually managed, because of the UN inquiry of Hariri's death, to lock up at least 4 of the Lebanese generals who worked for the Syrian Mukhabarat, the intelligence service. But many of these same Lebanese, including, for example, Walid Jumblat, the Druze leader, close friend of Saad Hariri, the son of the murdered ex-Prime Minister Rafik, they fear that 1559, because it also calls for the disarmament of the Hezbollah and the disarmament of the Palestinians in the refugee camps in Lebanon, is intended to make Lebanon weak enough to make a separate peace with Israel. And that after a new president is elected, and the Palestinians are disarmed and the Hezbollah are disarmed, then the American ambassador will arrive at the presidential palace. Look, we have a rather good idea for a peace treaty. Nothing wrong with peace with Israel, but in the right circumstances with other Arabs all as one. So the whole 1559 issue, in which of course we have the French, unlikely, Jacques Chirac, joining with the Americans in putting pressure on the Syrians, partly of course because Jacques Chirac was a close personal friend of Hariri, who probably funded his election campaign in Paris. You have this extra dimension on top of the Iraq thing, and add to that the pressure now on Syria, another powerful nation. Well, I don't think it's that powerful, but that's how it's built up. And of course now we have the pressures on Iran. And we won't go into Iran because it's too complicated, but all I'll say is that up to now the Iranians have done nothing illegal, which is a point that all our editorial writers miss. Up to now they've done nothing illegal. Up to now. Best answer I can give you in time available.
Thank you for coming to lunch.
Sure. And the lady with the veil is going to come up here from over here and put her hand up. Oh, you're here. Sorry, forgive me. It makes you so anonymous, you see. Go ahead.
All right. The thing that bothers you the most is you mentioned you mentioned the gulf between the readers and the journalists in the U.S. press and on TV and on news channels. But they still read the same newspapers, they still watch the same television. I mean,
You do.
I'm sure they do as well. And then I don't know how they buy into whatever they read and whatever they listen. So I don't understand. I don't understand the connection. Like you said, are they indifferent? Do they care?
You mean the journalists?
No, I mean the readers.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because the readers elect the governments who are in power in the U.S., right? So it's a circle, and I don't understand the connections.
Okay. Look, American newspaper circulation is steadily declining, even small-town newspapers. And I'm not surprised. When I go to the States, I'm going back, I've just come from there today, one of the biggest burdens of one's life as a journalist is having to read the American press. And I'm sure it's a burden for Americans who are not journalists. But I think they understand what's going on. They understand that the newspapers are not telling them the full picture. No grown-up, sane, educated person could listen or read that Los Angeles Times story without laughing, surely. The problem, though, in the United States, you see, I think, and I've said this 2 nights ago at USC, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, is that in America, unlike Canada and Britain and Ireland, the academic world is very, very cut off from the people. I went to a seminar at George Mason University on the anniversary of September 11, 2002. It was the morning of September 11, 2002. And all the activists in the university were saying, how can we get into the mainstream press? I said, well, start calling the alternative press the mainstream and start calling the mainstream press the alternative press. You start by that way. But I said, one of the things I never see you do is you don't talk to ordinary people. The academics in the United States, I know this is not the same here, but the academics in the United States talk to each other. They're a privileged losing minority. They almost want to be martyrs to losing the cause. We warned and no one listened. But they won't go and talk to Amtrak crews or truck drivers at truck stops. You know, when I give lectures in the States, I always invite anyone I see beforehand to come along. I've had the bellhops in my hotel in Los Angeles come to my UCLA press conference. I've had an Amtrak crew came to a press conference, to a lecture I gave in Atlanta. In New York 2 weeks ago, an entire Aer Lingus Irish Airlines crew, which I was flying with, came to the lecture. And good, they were interested. One of them bought the book, you know. I mean, it's not just a question of making the odd profit from an airline crew. You know, the answer to the question is, if more and more people who did ordinary jobs, the sort of people in America who are going to join the Marines to pay for their education and be sent to Iraq, could be encouraged to come into universities and listen to you, for example, as opposed to just cutting off people and keeping them outside. It is not the same problem in Canada, though it does exist to some extent here. And it exists even less to Britain, but it's still there. But in the United States now, we're talking about America, we cut ourselves off, we people who want to speak, from those people who would like to hear. I went on a train from Washington some years ago, from Washington to Duluth in Georgia on the Amtrak. And the whole crew at the back of the train, all night we were discussing the Middle East, very openly, without any of these fears of the taboos that the late Edward Said talked about. But not in any racist or anti-Semitic way. We're talking frankly about what was happening on the West Bank. And they all had a pretty good idea. They'd all decoded television quite well. But there was no one to talk to them about it. So no doubt some of them later on would go off and join the Marines to pay for their education. There's your problem. The lady here, but just before you speak, maybe I can just find, you'll be next, and then, the gentleman right there, which I'm pointing to. Yes, that's right, the one with 2 hands up. Please go ahead. Yeah, well, you can say that later.
I think my question is a bit similar. I recently attended a lecture where Seymour Hersh spoke, and he was really pessimistic about the future of American journalism. And I was really upset to see that, since he's one of the few investigative and real truthful journalists left in the United States. So I guess from the other point of view, what do you think is the future of journalism in the U.S.?
I couldn't agree more with Seymour Hersh. He remains one of my heroes. He's the only blessing around, with 1 or 2 exceptions. I mean, let me go back and say what I sort of intimated just now. If Tom Friedman is the frontier of legitimate criticism in the media now in the United States, heaven help us. I think Tom would rather like to be the Secretary of State, but he is a friend of mine. He owes me lunch at DuPont Circle in Washington next time I go there. Look, I don't know what the future is. It can't go on as it does, because it is not serving the people, it is not challenging authority, it's become the creature of authority. It bends to authority. oddly enough, the more powerful the television station, the TV chain, and the more powerful and better produced the newspaper, the weaker it becomes. I think what happens is that they become so open to political influence and financially so liable to blackmail that the more powerful and potentially investigative the US media becomes, the less able they are to do that job. And I'm not sure how you get around that unless you start dealing with the issue of lobby groups. I'm not just meaning the Israeli lobby, I mean the gun lobby, the smoking lobby, which effectively exercise control over Congress. And that is one of the major problems in the United States. It's not a press problem, it's a national issue of the democratic process in the United States. One of the things that's happening in Britain now, for example, is that the Tory party supported the war. Tony Blair has effectively appointed himself leader of the Tory party, so the Tory party has become the Labour Party, and there's no more opposition in the British Parliament. And what's happened, rather tragically, but interestingly, is that the press in Britain has become the opposition, which is why my editor, Simon Kellner, talks about our newspaper as a views paper. And what Blair worries about in the morning is not what the Tories are going to ask him at question time in the House of Commons, it's what we're going to ask him in the Independent. You see what's happened? And I think that shouldn't be the case. You know, we are becoming a centre of power to be challenged, but there's no one to challenge us because he's up. So there are all kinds of dangers involved in that. In the United States, there's a similar phenomenon, but for different reasons, where you elect your congressman or woman, and off they go to the Hill, and the lobbyists get at them, and they suddenly start saying things and doing things and voting for things which you would never want them to do. Most of my mail at the moment comes from the United States, not from Britain. There are more readers, I suppose, through the internet, which I loathe, in the United States than there are in Britain. But the fact of the matter is that so many of them increasingly talk about what do we do with this flaw, this hoax democracy that's setting in, where we, the electors, elect democratically in a process we approve of and support people who go away and no longer represent us after they've been elected. Big problem. Sorry, wide-ranging answer to your question. Yes, sir. Maybe two more.
Yes, sir. Dave McPherson. I'm a dental student here at UWO.
Let me tell you, I'm frightened desperately of dentists. I'm more worried about dental work than I am Israeli air raids, American cluster bombs, phosphorus, or anything else. But you may speak, so I will just stand back here like this.
I'm only in second year, so you should be afraid of me. But I'm also in the Canadian Army, and I was leading the UN team in South Lebanon at Markabi in 95, 96. So I saw Hezbollah and how they operated. And I'm just wondering if Hezbollah is in Iraq, and just sort of out of personal interest, out of history, whatever happened to the leadership of the South Lebanese Army?
General Lahad is running a nightclub in Tel Aviv. Really? But it's also a restaurant, so you can go and eat there as well. Say hi to him. Okay, well, he was asking what happened to the SLA leadership in South Lebanon. He's referring to General Antoine Lahad. That's the answer to your second part of the question. Look, Hezbollah, are they in Iraq? Not with their weapons. Certainly, there are many members of Hezbollah who, as pilgrims, travel regularly, rather more than you would imagine, to Najaf and Kerbala via Baghdad. Clearly, the Hezbollah has an intelligence operation with it. It has an intelligence section. And I've no doubt, and I have every reason to say this with confidence, that they have people in Baghdad and they have people in Najaf and Kerbala who are reporting, no doubt, to Iran. But, there's plenty of local Shiites can report to Iran as well. Certainly, they appear to be a pretty efficient organization in running the various pilgrimage buses from Shiite areas of Lebanon via Syria into Iraq. But they are not assisting in the insurgency. That I'm certain of. So they're not playing an illegal role vis-a-vis Iraq. But since everything is shambles, chaos, anarchy, and illegal in Iraq anyway, it's a bit like trying to find a murderer on a mass grave, isn't it? Yes, if you like. I'll just pick two more people, and then I'm going to become exhausted. This gentleman over here, because he's extremely persistent, and maybe one more lady. Is there a lady here to balance it out? Because one has to be very... Yes, up there at the back, there's a lady. Is there? No, there isn't. What do we do in this society here? All right, two men. You. There we go. After him. Go ahead.
In your speech, you I thought that said something about history has a tendency to repeat itself. The British came and they suffered setbacks, and then the Americans.
It wasn't so much the repetition, which always happens in history. It was the fact that we don't take a history book and realize there's a repetition.
So it seems that war is an innate part of humanity, and part of being journalism is to inform human beings of war and inform human beings about the atrocities that are happening in the world. Do you think Western media and Western journalism has failed the average person in this regard? And do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that war is innately something that we should bind in with human beings. I'm not sure we all innately want to have wars and go to war.
No, on an individual level, I don't think we do, but on some sort of pan-national level, I mean...
I wouldn't say that for the Swedes, or the Norwegians, or the Danes, or the Swiss, or the Irish, or the Canadians. I mean... Sorry, let me go to the point of your question about what journalists do. I think wars increase circulation. It did dawn on me when we were getting very close to the invasion of Iraq, the number of newspapers that wanted to oppose the war, as we were opposing it on The Independent, but didn't want to oppose it too much, because when it began, everyone would be buying the newspaper. And it is true that circulations go up during war, I'm sorry to say. That doesn't mean that journalists are responsible for wars, no. But all prime ministers and presidents know that newspapers play an increasingly more powerful role and feel more powerful when their countries go to war. To that extent, I think there's a culpability involved. But sorry, yes, carry on.
And furthermore, is the corporatization of global media, as CNN, I can't watch CNN, but like BBC I find fair, but do you think that's also a further problem that kind of adds... Increasingly,
you'll find even the BBC has pressures on it. After the Hutton report, into the BBC's defence correspondent claimed that the dossier and the Downing Street was sexing up the evidence, which was completely true, of course.
And
let me finish. After that, the BBC's got to a stage where, for example, one of their anchors the other day, who is on contract, not staff, was questioning, I know this is the case because the anchor told me themselves, I will not even say man or woman, was questioning an Israeli minister on the grounds of how could you talk about targeted assassinations when what you're doing is murder. And immediately the interview was over, the duty producer in the studio came and admonished this anchor person and warned them their job would be at stake if they asked questions like that again. That's a real story from the BBC. So, I mean, I agree with you about CNN. The globalization of newspaper ownership. Well, look, why should all those famous editorials be written only in Winnipeg? Let's put it in local terms. Okay? You know, that's the end of the story, isn't it? And it shouldn't be, but they don't have the freedom, especially on the Middle East, to do that. I think we'd better go to the next guy, actually. Please, go ahead.
Welcome to London, Mr. Fisk.
I keep thinking London. I come from London, yes.
You said in your speech that you are surprised that the Arabs and Muslims are not much more violent.
Have shown so much restraint, yeah.
Is that a prediction from you that we're going to see in the future much more wars than we've seen in the past?
Much more
wars than we've seen so far?
Yes. I think so, yeah. I think, I mean, apart from a few bright lights in Lebanon, which could easily fade away for various reasons I won't go into now, I see no hope for peace between Palestinians and Israelis unless there is a fulfillment of UN Security Council Resolution 242. And it's not going to happen, because Bush himself has said there are facts on the ground that are going to remain. He's talking about the huge settlements, Mali, Adumim, etc. As long as there's a wall cutting Jerusalem off from the West Bank Palestinians, as long as the West Bank Palestinians can't have a capital in East Jerusalem. I mean, I'd like to see an international city in Jerusalem. I'd like to see an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. I don't think there'll be a one-state solution, not in our lifetime. Maybe there will, who knows. But I don't think unless 242 is adhered to, withdrawal of Israelis from territories occupied in the 67 war in return for security of all states in the area and stressing the non-acquisition of territory through war, unless that 242 resolution is abided by both sides, I don't think there'll be an end to the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, unfortunately. Sure.
Hi.
Can you stand back a little bit from the mic? That's fine. Yeah.
I feel really special because I live next to you in Beirut on Bliss Street. But anyway.
Bliss Street? No, you're 2 streets away. It's okay.
Yeah. I was just want to ask you about how much did the U.S. intervene in the killing of Rafik Hariri in Lebanon?
Intervene?
Like, how much did they intervene, like, in terms of the aftermath of the killing of Rafik Hariri and, like, in the elections after that? And what is the U.S. planning to do in Lebanon?
What is the what thing?
What is the U.S. planning
for Lebanon?
Yeah.
Okay, the second part of your question, I don't know the answer to, but I tried to outline the problems of 50-59 if they went on to disarm the Hezbollah and the Palestinian camp. How much did they interfere? The phrase Cedar Revolution was invented by the State Department spokesman, not by the Lebanese. So let's start off by seeing that the first and major symbol of change in Lebanon was a concoction of the State Department, even though it was the Lebanese 1 million strong demonstration that symbolized the demand for the truth about Hariri. I don't think the Americans needed to actually become deeply involved in what followed, because the Lebanese were doing it. For the first time ever, the Lebanese were actually taking their lives in their own hands and making decisions which were not necessarily what the political leaders wanted, and wasn't actually necessarily what the Americans always wanted. After all, the Hezbollah had their rally too, of 500,000 Lebanese. If you want to see how the Americans couldn't control events, it's the fact that one Hezbollah, having demanded complete democracy in Lebanon and got a democratic election, a Hezbollah man was elected and became a minister in the Lebanese government and was then told he wouldn't be allowed to visit Washington. He wasn't quite democratic elected enough, was he? I did notice, for example, that when Samir Kassir, the Lebanese journalist who was extremely critical of the Ba'athist regime in Damascus, and whom I know quite well, was murdered, I got to the scene of the killing in about 9 minutes. He was still lying in the car. And I found 3 FBI agents in shirts with FBI on, already there with the Lebanese army investigating. Clearly, American intelligence officers had considerable leeway with the current Lebanese authorities to move and work with them. But then again, Detlef Melis's own investigation, which publishes its final report on December 15th, same day as the Iraqi elections. I've chosen Beirut. I think it's going to be more important. Detlef Melis has himself been using American-trained and American, actually, U.S. police officers among his investigators. So the Americans are there on the ground within the UN, quite apart from the abilities they seem to have to put their own security agents onto the streets of Beirut with the permission of the Lebanese authorities. It'd be very interesting to know Fouad Siniora, the current Prime Minister of Lebanon, who was trained in the United States. You couldn't find a more pro-American guy, both in training and culture, was told 3 years ago by the American embassy that his multiple re-entry visas to the United States had been revoked on the grounds that 2 years earlier he'd put the equivalent of $5 in a charitable donation when he went to see Syed Fadlallah to celebrate Iftar at the end of a day during Ramadan. I assume that now he's the Prime Minister. After all, if Mr. Ahmed Shalabi, who's got an FBI investigation, can go to Washington, I assume Mr. Siniora is now welcome in the United States. Best answer I can give you is the one more question. I'm looking for a lady to ask it, since it seems to be a very, very misogynist. There's a lady in a blue scarf, yes. And this will be the last question. The microphone, yes, it's over here, my friend. Thank you.
I actually have 2 questions.
Hi.
One is just yes and no.
Go ahead.
Okay. First question, is Bush really running the U.S.? And second question, do you have anything to say about Latin America?
Okay, second question first. No, I don't cover Latin America. I read about it. I hate journalists who talk through their mouths and know nothing. I can't answer that. Well, Bush thinks he's running America. He thinks he is. I rather think the Defense Secretary and his friends are probably running the United States and Dick Cheney. That's my feeling.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't work in Washington either, but I should think most of you would probably agree with me. I think that Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld, if you read all the comments from Condoleezza Rice off the record and what Colin Powell said, I reckon it's Cheney and Rumsfeld. But, you know, I don't live in Washington. That's it, folks. Thank you. Yes, Troy. There you go.
Now I'd like to call upon somebody to thank our speaker for a very insightful and thoughtful presentation. Dario, come on up. Kuzmanovic, come on up and thank our speaker. By the way, there will be a book signing at the end. I'll give you some details about it after we've thanked our speaker.
Hi, my name is Dario, and I'm president of Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights. I just wanted to make a couple of announcements tonight. I promise they're not going to be as riveting as the talk you just heard. First off, I want to thank Mr. Fisk for coming to London tonight. I can say that I've learned more tonight in the 2 hours than I have in the 10 years that I've done my undergrad here at UWO. Mr. Fisk is one of the few beacons of light in these morally murky times of the media, and someone for whom a lot of us have a great deal of respect and admiration. As a small token of appreciation, please accept this gift from our club that Nadine is going to present to you. Thank you. Also, I would like to extend our thanks to the two people without whom this night couldn't be possible. That's Professor Coulter and Faisal Joseph, and we have gifts for you too. And Arij is going to present them to you. Thank you. The event tonight has been sponsored by FIMS, Friends of Seville, UWO Bookstore, and SPHR UWO. Finally, I would like to remind you to please sign a petition for SPHR on your way out if you haven't already, or pick up the information sheet that we've been handing out. Our student government here at the University of Western is determined to silence our club from speaking on behalf of Palestinian human rights and educating the university on the situation in occupied Palestinian territories. We would like to invite all students to join us in working for human rights and working against the tyranny of occupation. And for those who will not, just know that with our work, the tyranny will stop, the wall will fall, and the occupation will end. Thank you.
Robert has kindly agreed with respect to his book signing. You know, it's really something when you get an opportunity with a man with much experience, and I'm looking forward to my read of it. Well worth the price, and I think it's something that we need to examine and take a look at. So he's kindly agreed to be here for the book signing. I encourage you to do it, and we'll all be better off for it. Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind attention.